The first snow of the season fell early that year in Montana Territory, coating the vast expanse of grassland in a thin white shroud that promised harder times to come. Owen Whitlock stood at the window of his cabin, watching the flakes drift down through the gathering darkness. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, searching the horizon for any sign of movement along the trail that wound up from the valley below. He lived alone in the old cabin, set apart from the main house where his younger brother Caleb resided. The separation had been his choice, made 3 years ago when he'd returned from the war. The nightmares were easier to bear when there was no one around to hear him cry out in his sleep, no one to see him wake drenched in sweat, clutching at wounds that had long since scarred over. The war had left its marks on Owen in ways both visible and hidden. A jagged scar ran from his left shoulder down across his chest, courtesy of Confederate grape shot at Antietam. His left hand bore the stiffness of poorly healed bones, broken when a horse had fallen on him during the retreat from Bull Run. But the deepest wounds were those no one could see, the faces of dead men that haunted his dreams, the weight of things done and undone that pressed upon his conscience like stones. At 32, Owen looked older than his years. His dark hair, once thick and unruly, had thinned and showed gray at the temples. Deep lines creased his weathered face, carved there by pain and sleepless nights. His gray eyes, which had once sparkled with youth and ambition, now held a distant, haunted quality that made folks in town uncomfortable. They crossed the street when they saw him coming, whispering behind their hands about that Whitlock boy who came back wrong from the war. His brother Caleb was everything Owen had once been, young, vital, full of dreams and plans. At 25, Caleb stood to inherit the ranch their father had built from nothing, transforming raw Montana earth into profitable cattle land, where Owen was quiet and withdrawn. Caleb was boisterous and social, where Owen avoided the company of others. Caleb sought it out, spending his evenings in town at the saloon, playing cards and spinning tales. It had been Caleb's idea to send for a mail-order bride. "This place needs a woman's touch," he'd declared one evening over supper, gesturing around the main house with its bare walls and utilitarian furnishings. "And I need a wife if I'm to run this ranch proper. A man can't build a legacy without sons to pass it on to." Owen had said nothing, merely continued eating his beans and biscuit in silence. But privately, he'd wondered what kind of woman would travel halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met, based solely on a few letters and a tintype photograph. Desperation, most likely. The same kind that drove men to drink, or violence, or worse. The matrimonial agency in St. Louis had been efficient. Within 2 months, they'd found a suitable candidate, a widow named Eleanor Price, 27 years of age. Originally from Missouri, her husband had died in the cholera outbreak of '81, leaving her with debts and no family to turn to. She could read and write, had experience keeping house, and was willing to travel to Montana Territory to begin a new life. Caleb had been delighted, showing Owen the small photograph that had arrived with her letter of acceptance. Even in the faded image, Eleanor Price was handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and direct eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from her face, and she wore a high-necked dress of what appeared to be worn calico. "She's perfect," Caleb had announced. "Look at those hands, strong, capable. She'll do well out here." That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, Caleb had thrown himself into preparations with characteristic enthusiasm. He'd ordered new curtains from the mercantile, had the house scrubbed from top to bottom, even purchased a proper bed to replace the narrow cot he'd been sleeping on. The wedding was to be simple but respectable. Caleb was already well-liked in town, and folks were curious to meet his bride. 3 days ago, Caleb had ridden to town to finalize arrangements with the minister and collect supplies for the wedding feast. He was supposed to be back by now, but the early snow had likely delayed him. The roads would be treacherous, and Caleb, for all his confidence, was cautious with the ranch's horses. Eleanor Price was due to arrive on the evening stage. Owen had offered to meet her, but Caleb had waved him off. "I'll be back in plenty of time," he'd said. "You just make sure there's a fire going in the main house. Don't want her first impression to be a cold hearth." So Owen had done as asked, walking the quarter-mile from his cabin to the main house as shadows lengthened across the snow. He'd built up the fire, checked that the lamps were filled with oil, even set out the good china their mother had brought from Pennsylvania all those years ago. Then he'd returned to his own cabin to wait and watch. The knock, when it came, was so faint he almost missed it over the wind. 3 tentative raps, barely audible through the thick wooden door. Owen frowned, setting down the book he'd been attempting to read by lamplight. No one came to his cabin. It was understood in these parts that Owen Whitlock preferred his solitude. He opened the door to find a woman standing on his doorstep, and, for a moment, he could only stare. She was tall for a woman, reaching nearly to his shoulder, but thin to the point of gauntness. Her traveling dress, which might once have been a deep blue, was now faded to the color of twilight and soaked through with snow and mud. No coat, no gloves. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet straggles around a face gone pale with cold. Her lips were nearly blue, and she swayed on her feet as though the wind might blow her over. But it was her eyes that held him, large and dark, filled with exhaustion and something else, something he recognized from his own reflection. The look of someone who had been pushed to the very edge of endurance and somehow found the strength to take one more step. "Please," she said, and her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for the Whitlock Ranch. They said, at the stage stop, they said it was this way, but I think I'm lost. You're Eleanor Price." It wasn't a question. She nodded, then shivered so violently her teeth chattered. You're Mr. Whitlock? Caleb?" "No, I'm Owen, his brother." He stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Come inside before you freeze to death." She hesitated for just a moment, propriety warring with necessity, then stumbled across the threshold. Owen caught her elbow as her knees buckled, steadying her. Through the wet fabric of her dress, he could feel how thin she was, bones sharp beneath skin. "Where's your coat?" he asked, guiding her to the chair nearest the stove. "Lost." Her voice was thick with unshed tears. "With my trunk, the stage. There was an accident. The wheel broke crossing a creek. My trunk fell off, went downstream. The driver said he couldn't wait, said I'd have to make do." She looked up at him, and he saw shame mixed with the exhaustion. "I walked from the crossroads. They said it was only 2 miles, but the snow—" 3 miles. Owen corrected quietly, and uphill most of the way. He moved efficiently, stoking the fire in the stove until it roared, then fetching a blanket from his bed. She took it gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders as he set water to heat for tea. Where is Caleb?" she asked, looking around the sparse cabin with obvious confusion. "In town. He was supposed to be back by now, but the snow likely delayed him." Owen found himself avoiding her gaze as he spoke. "This isn't the main house. That's further on. I live here." "Oh." She absorbed this information, then attempted to rise. "I should go to the proper house then. I don't want to impose—" "Sit down." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw her flinch. He softened his tone. "You're half frozen and dead on your feet. You'll stay here until you're warm and I can take you up to the main house proper." She sank back into the chair, clearly too exhausted to argue. Owen busied himself making tea, acutely aware of her presence in his space. It had been years since a woman had been in his cabin. The last had been Mary Stewart, the doctor's daughter, come to check on him when he'd been laid up with fever. She'd left quickly, discomfited by his scars and his silence. He handed Eleanor a cup of tea, noting how her hands shook as she took it. "When did you last eat?" "This morning, at the way station." She sipped the tea, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her. "Thank you. You're very kind." "Kind?" Owen almost laughed at that. He wasn't kind. He was practical. A frozen woman on his doorstep was a problem to be solved. Nothing more. He found some leftover biscuits and salt pork, set them on a plate before her. She ate slowly, with the careful precision of someone who had known true hunger. As she ate, he studied her in the lamplight. The photograph hadn't done her justice. There was a strength to her features that the camera hadn't captured, a determined set to her jaw that spoke of hardships endured and overcome. Her hands, as Caleb had noted, were indeed strong and capable, but also graceful in their movements. "You've come a long way," he said finally, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She nodded, setting down the empty plate. "From Missouri. 3 days by train, then 2 by stage." A bitter smile crossed her face. "I sold everything I had for the fair, even my mother's wedding ring, and now—" She gestured at her muddy, torn dress. "This is all I have left. Caleb will see you're provided for." The words tasted like dust in his mouth. He's a good man. He'll be a good husband. You love your brother." It wasn't a question, but the way she said it made him look at her sharply. "He's all the family I have left." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he had the unsettling feeling she could see straight through him, past the scars and the silence to the broken thing beneath. Then she looked away, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "The snow's getting worse," she observed. Owen glanced at the window. She was right. What had been light flurries an hour ago was now a proper storm, wind driving the snow in horizontal sheets. Travel to the main house would be treacherous in the dark, especially with someone in Eleanor's weakened condition. "You'll stay here tonight," he decided. "I'll take you to the main house in the morning when the storm's passed." "But that wouldn't be proper. I'm engaged to your brother. Propriety won't keep you warm if you freeze to death trying to walk in a blizzard." He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the conversation. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep by the stove." "I couldn't." "You will." He moved to the small alcove that served as his bedroom, gathering a few things. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it. Privy's out back, but I wouldn't recommend it until the storm passes. There's a chamber pot under the bed." He could see her face flush at the mention of such intimate necessities, but she merely nodded. "Thank you. Mr. Whitlock, Owen, Thank you." He grunted in response, settling himself in the chair by the stove with a worn quilt. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, the only sounds were the crack of wood in the stove and Eleanor's quiet movements as she prepared for bed. "Owen?" Her voice came soft from the alcove. "What? What happened to your parents? You said Caleb was all the family you had left." He stared into the flames, debating whether to answer. Finally, "Fever took them. 5 winters ago. Ma went first, Pa a week later. I'm sorry. No need to be. It was quick, at least." Silence fell again, but it was different now, less strained. He heard the rustle of fabric as she lay down, the creak of the old bed frame. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Owen remained awake, watching the fire and listening to the storm. Tomorrow, he would take Eleanor Price to meet her bridegroom. She would become Mrs. Caleb Whitlock, mistress of the main house, mother to Caleb's children. She would bring warmth and life to the cold ranch, just as Caleb had hoped, and Owen would return to his solitude, to his ghosts and his silence. It was better that way, safer, for everyone. But as the night wore on and the storm raged outside, he found himself thinking of the way she'd looked at him, really looked at him, without fear or pity. The way she'd said, "You love your brother," as though she understood something he'd never put into words. Dangerous thoughts. He pushed them away, focusing instead on the practical matters of tomorrow. But still, he remained awake, keeping watch through the long, cold night while Eleanor Price slept in his bed, her presence filling the cabin with something he couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. The morning came gray and bitter cold, with snow still falling in thick curtains across the Montana landscape. Owen woke stiff from his night in the chair, his bad shoulder aching from the awkward position. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin cold enough that his breath misted in the air. Eleanor was already awake, standing by the window in her wrinkled traveling dress, watching the storm. She'd attempted to pin her hair back up, but without her lost belongings. It hung loose down her back in dark waves. In the pale morning light, she looked younger, more vulnerable than she had the night before. "The storm's not letting up," she said without turning around. "No." Owen stood, working the kinks from his back. "Might be days before it passes completely." She turned then, and he saw the worry in her eyes. "Caleb will be concerned." "Caleb's likely stuck in town himself. He knows better than to travel in weather like this." Owen moved to the stove, feeding it fresh wood. "Are you hungry?" "I couldn't impose further. It's not an imposition. It's breakfast." He found his tone had come out sharp again and made an effort to soften it. "I have to eat whether you're here or not." A small smile crossed her face. "Then yes, I'm hungry." They worked together in unexpected harmony, Eleanor finding the coffee and setting it to brew while Owen mixed batter for flapjacks. She moved around his small kitchen with quiet efficiency, not asking where things were, but somehow finding them anyway. It was strange having someone else in his space, but not unpleasant as he'd expected it to be. "You cook well for a bachelor," she observed, watching him flip the flapjacks with practiced ease. "Had to learn. Caleb can barely boil water without burning it." He set a plate before her, then settled across the small table with his own. "During the war, I was often on cooking duty. The other men said I had a knack for making hardtack and salt pork almost edible." It was more than he'd said about the war to anyone in years. Eleanor seemed to sense this, merely nodding as she poured coffee for both of them. "My husband couldn't cook either," she said after a moment. "James, he was a clerk at the general store. Gentle hands, gentle soul. The cholera took him in 3 days. I'm sorry." She shrugged, but he saw the pain that flickered across her face. "We'd only been married 2 years. No children, thank the Lord. I couldn't have borne watching them starve after he died." "Is that why you answered Caleb's advertisement? Starvation?" "Among other reasons." She met his gaze directly. "A widow with no family, no money, and no prospects has few choices. Mr. Whitlock, your brother offered respectability and security. That's more than most can promise." They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the wind continued to howl, driving snow against the windows. The world had shrunk to just this cabin, just the two of them isolated from everything beyond. After breakfast, Eleanor insisted on washing the dishes despite Owen's protests. He watched her work, noting the way she hummed softly under her breath, some melody he didn't recognize. It had been so long since he'd heard music in his home. "What happened to your hand?" she asked suddenly, and he realized he'd been flexing his stiff fingers unconsciously. "Horse fell on it, during the war." "May I see?" He hesitated, then extended his left hand. She dried her own hands and took his gently, examining the crooked fingers with a practical eye. "It wasn't set properly." She said, "I could show you some exercises that might help with the stiffness. My mother had rheumatics, and the doctor taught her movements to keep her joints flexible." "It's fine as it is." She released his hand but gave him a look that suggested she didn't believe him. Pride's a cold comfort on winter mornings when you can barely make a fist. He found himself almost smiling at her directness. "Speaking from experience?" "I've had my share of cold comfort, yes." She returned to the dishes. Pride was about all I had left by the time I answered that advertisement. The day stretched on, the storm showing no signs of abating. They fell into an easy rhythm, tending the fire, preparing simple meals, talking in fits and starts. Eleanor mended a tear in her dress with needle and thread from Owen's meager sewing kit. Owen worked on repairing a broken bridle, his hands steady despite their stiffness. "Tell me about Caleb." Eleanor said as afternoon shadows lengthened. What should I know about my intended? Owen considered his words carefully. He's nothing like me, full of life, always laughing. He'll make you smile even when you don't want to. He's generous, perhaps too much so. He'd give away his last dollar to someone in need. And his faults. He's young, impulsive. Sometimes he acts before he thinks. He can be... Owen searched for the right word. Careless. Not cruel, just thoughtless. Like a boy who hasn't quite grown into a man's responsibilities. Eleanor nodded slowly. And he wants children. Yes, he's spoken of it often. Building a legacy, he calls it. Do you want children? The question caught him off guard. I'm not the one getting married. That wasn't what I asked. He set down the bridle, uncomfortable with the turn of conversation. What I want doesn't matter. Doesn't it? She studied him with those dark, knowing eyes. You live alone by choice. You keep yourself apart, but that doesn't mean you don't have wants, needs. You don't know me. No, she agreed. But I recognize the look of someone who's given up on wanting anything for themselves. I wore that look for months after James died. The wind gusted suddenly, rattling the door in its frame. Owen stood abruptly, moving to check the latch. Storm's getting worse. Eleanor let the subject drop, but he felt her eyes on him as he unnecessarily adjusted the already secure door. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the air charged with something he couldn't name. That evening, as they shared another simple meal, the tension eased somewhat. Eleanor told him about her life in Missouri, the small house she'd shared with James, the garden she'd tended. Owen found himself talking too, sharing memories of the ranch before the war, when his parents were alive and the future seemed full of possibility. You must have been close, you and Caleb, she said. We were, before. He stared into his coffee cup. The war changed things, changed me. Caleb tried to understand, but how could he? He was too young to fight. He stayed here, kept the ranch going while I... He trailed off. While you did what you had to do. Did I? The words came out bitter. Sometimes I think I had a choice. I could have stayed, claimed I was needed here. Other men did. But not you. No, not me. I thought it was about honor, duty. Turned out it was about mud and blood and watching boys die for ground that didn't matter. He realized his hands were clenched and deliberately relaxed them. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this. Perhaps I do. Eleanor's voice was gentle. If we're to be family, shouldn't I know you? Family. The word sat strangely in his mind. She would be his sister-in-law. They would see each other at Sunday dinners, holidays. She would bear Caleb's children, and he would be Uncle Owen, the strange, silent man who lived apart. Night fell early, the storm still raging. They prepared for bed with the same arrangement as before, Eleanor taking the bed while Owen settled by the stove. But sleep eluded him. He could hear her restlessness, the creak of the bed as she shifted position. Owen, her voice came soft through the darkness. Yes? I'm frightened. He sat up, instantly alert. Of what? Everything. Tomorrow. Marriage to a man I've never met. This place, the cold. Her voice broke slightly. I've been frightened for so long. I thought I'd grown used to it, but now... He heard her rise, heard her bare feet on the floor. She appeared in the doorway of the alcove, wrapped in the quilt from the bed, her face pale in the dying firelight. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't burden you with this. It's not a burden. He found he meant it. Fear's nothing to be ashamed of. She moved closer to the stove, sinking down to sit on the floor near his chair. Were you frightened? During the war? Every day. But you still fought. Fighting's easy when you're scared. It's the quiet after that's hard. He looked down at her, huddled in the quilt. You're braver than you know. Eleanor Price, coming all this way, starting over, that takes courage. Or desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire. Owen was acutely aware of her presence, the way the firelight caught in her dark hair, the curve of her shoulder beneath the quilt. It had been so long since he'd felt anything beyond numbness. But something stirred in his chest now, something dangerous and unwelcome. "I should go back to bed," she said finally, but made no move to rise. "You should." Still, neither moved. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind seemed to ease slightly, the howling diminishing to a low moan. "Tell me something good," Eleanor said suddenly. "Something from before the war, a happy memory." Owen thought for a moment. There was a dance. Summer of '59. The whole county came. Ma wore her blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions. Pa played his fiddle. Caleb was just 16, trying to impress the girls with his dancing. I was 20. Thought I knew everything there was to know about the world. Did you dance? Some. There was a girl, Rebecca Morrison. Hair like corn silk and a laugh that carried across the room. He smiled at the memory. I was too shy to ask her for more than one dance. Caleb teased me about it for months after. What happened to her? Married Tom Henderson the next year. They moved to California. Just as well. I had nothing to offer her when I came back. Eleanor rose then, the quilt trailing behind her like wings. For a moment, she stood looking down at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "You have more to offer than you think. Owen Whitlock," she said softly. Then she was gone, returning to the alcove and the cold bed. Owen remained by the fire, his thoughts churning like the snow outside. Tomorrow, if the weather cleared, he would take her to Caleb, would watch his brother's face light up at the sight of his bride, would return to his solitude and try to forget the way she'd looked at him, the way her presence had warmed his cold cabin in ways that had nothing to do with the fire. But tonight, with the storm still raging and the world reduced to just this small space, he allowed himself to imagine what might have been in a different life, a different time. It was foolish and dangerous and utterly pointless. But for just these few hours, he let himself feel something other than numbness. The fire burned low again, and he fed it fresh wood, keeping watch through another long night. In the morning, everything would change. But for now, Eleanor Price slept in his bed, and the storm held the rest of the world at bay, and that was enough. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine white snow. Owen stood at the window, watching the sun emerge for the first time in days, its light almost painful after the long gray hours. Behind him, Eleanor moved quietly about the cabin, folding the quilt she'd used, straightening things that didn't need straightening. "I suppose we should go," she said finally, and he heard the reluctance in her voice that matched his own. "Yes." Neither moved. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say. Then, from outside, came the sound of horses and voices calling, "Owen! Owen! You in there? Caleb!" Owen's stomach twisted as he recognized his brother's voice, jubilant and careless as always. He moved to the door, taking a breath before opening it. Caleb sat astride his bay gelding, grinning widely despite the cold. His hat was pushed back, revealing sandy hair and a face flushed with cold and excitement. Beside him, Tom Henderson from town held the reins of a spare horse. "There you are. We've been searching everywhere. When the stage driver said he'd left a woman at the crossroads in the storm, I feared the worst." Caleb's eyes went past Owen to Eleanor, who had appeared in the doorway. His grin widened. "Miss Price, Eleanor, thank God you're safe." He swung down from his horse with characteristic energy, bounded up the steps, and swept Eleanor's hand into both of his. "I'm Caleb. You're intended Lord, but you're prettier than your picture. Are you hurt? The driver said you lost your trunk." Eleanor seemed momentarily overwhelmed by his enthusiasm. No, I'm not hurt. Your brother was kind enough to shelter me from the storm." "Of course he was. Owen's always been the responsible one." Caleb turned to his brother, clapping him on the shoulder with enough force to make Owen wince. "Thank you, brother. I should have known you'd take care of things." Owen stepped back, his face carefully neutral. She needed help. Well, come on then. Let's get you to the house. Mrs. Morrison from town is there. She's been cooking all morning. Half the county's turned out to meet you. Caleb was already guiding Eleanor toward the spare horse, his hand possessive on her elbow. Perhaps Miss Price would prefer to rest first, Owen said quietly. She's had a difficult journey. Nonsense. She's made of sterner stuff than that. Aren't you, darling? Caleb helped Eleanor mount, his hands lingering at her waist. Besides, everyone's waiting. We'll have you married by sunset if the Reverend stays sober enough. Eleanor's eyes found Owen's over Caleb's shoulder. Something passed between them. A look that lasted only a moment but seemed to contain entire conversations. Then she turned her attention to managing her skirts on the unfamiliar saddle, and the moment broke. The ride to the main house was mercifully short. Caleb filled the silence with chatter about the ranch, the wedding plans, the people she'd meet. Eleanor responded when necessary, but Owen, riding behind them, could see the tension in her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the reins. The main house came into view, and Owen saw it as Eleanor must, a sprawling two-story structure of log and stone, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, horses and wagons already gathering in the yard. It was impressive in its way, a testament to their father's ambition and hard work. But after the intimacy of the cabin, it seemed cold and imposing. Home sweet home, Caleb announced proudly. What do you think? It's very large, Eleanor managed. Wait until you see the inside. I've had it cleaned top to bottom. New curtains in the parlor, just for you. They dismounted in the yard, where a crowd had already gathered. Women in their Sunday best clustered on the porch. Men stood in groups by the barn. Children ran between the wagons. All eyes turned to Eleanor as Caleb helped her down, whispers rippling through the crowd. Mrs. Morrison, the doctor's wife and the town's self-appointed social arbiter, swept forward. You poor dear, such an ordeal. Come inside at once. We'll get you properly dressed. She shot a disapproving look at Eleanor's travel-worn appearance. Caleb, you should have sent word immediately when she arrived. She was safe with Owen, Caleb said, but something in Mrs. Morrison's expression made him frown. Weren't you, darling? Perfectly safe, Eleanor said firmly. Mr. Whitlock was a complete gentleman, but the damage was done. Owen could see the speculation in the faces around them, the way eyebrows raised and meaningful looks were exchanged. In a community this small, spending 2 nights unchaperoned with a man not her intended was enough to start tongues wagging. Well, no harm done, Mrs. Morrison said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Come along, dear. Let's get you presentable. Eleanor was swept away in a flutter of feminine concern, leaving Owen and Caleb standing in the yard. The easy camaraderie of moments before had evaporated. Caleb's expression was thoughtful as he watched the women disappear into the house. 2 nights, he said quietly. The storm, I know. Caleb turned to face his brother. I'm not accusing you of anything. Owen, I know you better than that, but others... He gestured at the crowd. You know how people talk. Then perhaps you should have been here to meet her yourself. The words came out sharper than Owen intended. Caleb's face flushed. I was arranging our wedding, making sure everything was perfect for her. She walked 3 miles in a blizzard with no coat, nearly froze to death because you weren't where you said you'd be. That's not fair. Fair? Owen stepped closer, lowering his voice. You want to talk about fair? You ordered a woman like she was cattle, and then you weren't even here to receive delivery. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. At least I'm trying to build something, to have a life. What are you doing besides hiding in that cabin, feeling sorry for yourself? The words hit like physical blows. Owen turned away, jaw tight. Take care of her, Caleb. She deserves better than carelessness. He walked away before Caleb could respond, heading not for the house but for the barn, He couldn't bear the thought of going inside, of watching Eleanor be transformed into Caleb's bride, while the memory of their quiet conversations still echoed in his mind. The wedding preparations proceeded with relentless efficiency. Owen stayed in the barn, tending to horses that didn't need tending, until Tom Henderson found him. "Your brother's looking for you. Says you're to stand as his best man." Owen wanted to refuse, but that would only fuel more gossip. He followed Tom back to the house, where he found chaos in full swing. Women bustled about with flowers and ribbons. Men sampled the whiskey Caleb had bought for the occasion, and somewhere a fiddle was being tuned. Caleb appeared, already dressed in his best suit. "There you are. Come on, you need to change. Can't have my best man looking like he's been mucking stalls." "Caleb." "No." His brother's face was serious now. "Whatever's bothering you, we'll discuss it later. Today, I'm getting married, and I need my brother beside me. Please, Owen." Owen nodded reluctantly. He owed Caleb that much, at least. He changed into his own seldom-worn suit, the shoulders too broad now for his thinner frame. In the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The clothes made him look respectable, but his eyes remained hollow, haunted. The ceremony was held in the parlor, hastily decorated with pine boughs and winter berries. The Reverend, despite Caleb's earlier concerns, appeared reasonably sober. The room was packed with the neighbors and townspeople, all eager to witness the marriage of Caleb Whitlock to his mail-order bride. Then Eleanor appeared, and Owen forgot how to breathe. The women had worked their magic. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore a borrowed dress of pale blue silk that complemented her coloring perfectly. But it was her face that held him, carefully composed, chin high, but her eyes betraying the fear underneath. She looked beautiful. She looked trapped. Caleb beamed as she approached, taking her hand with obvious pride. They stood before the Reverend, the perfect picture of a frontier couple beginning their new life together. Owen stood to Caleb's right, the ring heavy in his pocket, and tried not to think about how her hand had felt in his when she'd examined his injured fingers. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, and Owen forced himself to focus on the words. The ceremony proceeded with painful inevitability. Vows were exchanged, promises made. When the Reverend asked for the ring, Owen produced it, careful not to let his fingers brush Caleb's as he handed it over. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend intoned. "You may kiss your bride." Caleb did so with enthusiasm, bending Eleanor back dramatically to the delight of the crowd. She emerged flushed and breathless, and for just a moment, her eyes found Owen's again. He saw resignation there, and something else, a plea, perhaps, or an apology. Then the moment passed, and she was Mrs. Caleb Whitlock, swept away in a tide of congratulations and good wishes. The parlor erupted into celebration. Fiddle music filled the air, whiskey flowed freely, and the wedding feast Mrs. Morrison had organized was brought out in abundance. Owen retreated to a corner, nursing a single glass of whiskey he had no intention of finishing. He watched Caleb spin Eleanor around the makeshift dance floor, watched her smile and laugh at appropriate moments. To everyone else, she must have seemed the picture of bridal happiness. But Owen had spent 2 days learning to read her silences, and he could see the strain in the set of her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. "She's lovely." "Mrs." Morrison appeared at his elbow, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was fishing for gossip. Though I must say, the circumstances of her arrival were quite irregular. Owen said nothing. 2 nights alone in your cabin, in the storm, of course. Still, people will talk. Then they should find better things to occupy their time. "Mrs." Morrison sniffed. "I'm only thinking of her reputation. And yours, of course. A woman's good name is so easily tarnished. Her good name is now Whitlock," Owen said coldly. "I trust that will be sufficient protection against idle gossip." He walked away before she could respond. But the damage was done. He could see it in the way conversation stopped when Eleanor passed, the way women whispered behind their fans. The story would grow in the telling, as stories always did in small communities starved for scandal. As evening wore on, Owen noticed Eleanor's energy flagging. She maintained her composure, but he could see exhaustion in the droop of her shoulders, the way she gripped Caleb's arm for support. But Caleb, flushed with whiskey and triumph, seemed oblivious to his bride's fatigue. "Dance with me again, wife," he called out, already pulling her toward the floor despite her murmured protest. Owen had seen enough. He slipped out the back door into the cold night air, breathing deeply of the sharp, clean scent of snow and pine. The celebration continued behind him. Muffled by walls and distance, he should leave, return to his cabin, let the newlyweds have their wedding night in peace. But something made him linger, standing in the shadow of the barn, looking up at the star-scattered sky. After a while, he heard the kitchen door open and close. Soft footsteps crunched through the snow. "I needed air," Eleanor said, appearing beside him wrapped in a borrowed shawl. "You should be inside. It's your wedding night." "Caleb is playing cards. He said I should rest, that I looked tired." A bitter smile crossed her face. "My wedding night, and my husband would rather play poker with his friends." Owen didn't know what to say to that. They stood in silence, breath misting in the cold air. "I keep thinking about the cabin," she said quietly. "How peaceful it was. Just the storm and the fire and—" She stopped herself. "Eleanor?" "No." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight, he could see tears on her cheeks. "Don't say whatever noble thing you're about to say. I know my duty. I made my choice. I'll be a good wife to your brother." "I know you will. But I need you to know." She stopped, struggling for words. These past 2 days, they were a gift. To feel safe. To be seen as more than just a solution to someone's problem. I won't forget that. She rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, the touch of her lips brief and burning. Then she was gone, hurrying back through the snow to the house where her new life waited. Owen stood in the darkness for a long time, his hand pressed to his cheek where she'd kissed him. Inside. The celebration continued, Caleb's laughter rising above the music. Tomorrow, Owen would return to his cabin, to his solitude and his ghosts. But they would be joined now by new phantoms, the memory of Eleanor's presence, the echo of her voice, the weight of possibilities that could never be. He turned and walked away into the night, leaving the warm lights of the house behind. The celebration would go on without him. It always had. Dawn came pale and cold to the Whitlock ranch. Eleanor woke alone in the marriage bed, still wearing her wedding dress. The pillow beside her bore no indentation. The sheets on that side remained crisp and undisturbed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb's voice from downstairs, rough with hangover, arguing with someone about a lost bet from the night's card game. She rose slowly, her body aching from exhaustion and the tension of maintaining appearances through the long celebration. The borrowed dress felt like armor she no longer needed to wear. She changed into her simple traveling dress, the only clothing she owned, and tried not to think about how different this morning was from what she'd imagined. When she descended the stairs, she found Caleb slumped at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Empty bottles littered the surface, and the smell of stale whiskey permeated the air. He looked up at her approach, his eyes bloodshot and guilty. "Eleanor, my dear wife." The words came out slurred despite the early hour. "I'm sorry about last night. The boys got to celebrating, and time got away from me." "It's all right," she said quietly, moving to clear the bottles. "No, it's not." He caught her hand, his grip too tight. "A man shouldn't abandon his bride on their wedding night, but you look so tired." And Henderson had brought out his special deck, and... He trailed off, releasing her hand to rub his temples. "I'm not much of a husband." "Am I?" Eleanor said nothing, busying herself with making coffee. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the safest response to a man's self-recrimination. Caleb watched her work, something calculating in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "My brother took good care of you during the storm." Her hand stilled for just a moment. He was very kind. Owen's always been kind. Too kind. Sometimes picks up strays, broken things. Caleb's laugh was harsh. Suppose that's why he came back from the war the way he did. Too soft for what needed doing. I wouldn't call him soft. No. Caleb leaned back, studying her. What would you call him then? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Decent, honorable, a gentleman. Something flickered across Caleb's face. Jealousy, perhaps, or suspicion. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual careless smile. Well, you'll have plenty of time to get to know him better. He takes Sunday dinner here sometimes, when he can be persuaded to leave that cabin. The days that followed fell into an uncomfortable rhythm. Caleb was affectionate enough when sober, bringing her small gifts from town, praising her cooking, making plans for improving the house. But the drinking started earlier each day, and with it came a meanness that reminded her why desperate women sometimes preferred the uncertainty of marriage to a stranger over the certainty of destitution. She threw herself into the work of the house, grateful for the distraction. There was plenty to do, years of bachelor neglect to remedy, a kitchen garden to plan for spring, clothes to mend and meals to prepare. The physical labor was familiar, comforting even. It was the nights that were difficult. Caleb came to her bed irregularly, usually after drinking, his hands rough and his breath sour with whiskey. He performed his marital duties with the same careless efficiency he brought to everything else, then fell into heavy sleep, leaving Eleanor to stare at the ceiling and try not to remember the gentle way Owen had looked at her in the firelight. A week passed before she saw Owen again. She was hanging laundry in the bitter wind, her fingers numb with cold, when she spotted him riding along the ridge that separated his cabin from the main house. He paused, a dark silhouette against the white sky, and she knew he was watching her. She raised her hand in greeting, and after a long moment, he touched his hat brim in response before disappearing over the rise. That night, Caleb noticed her distraction at dinner. You're quiet tonight. Am I? I'm sorry. Just tired, I suppose. You work too hard. He reached for the whiskey bottle, his third glass of the evening. We should get you some help. Maybe the Morrison girl could come do the washing. That's not necessary. I can manage. My wife shouldn't have to manage. You should have proper help, proper clothes. His voice was rising, taking on the belligerent tone she'd learned to fear. Nothing but that same damn dress every day. What will people think? People will think what they choose to think regardless. It was the wrong thing to say. Caleb's face darkened. And what's that supposed to mean? Nothing. I only meant, I know what you meant. He stood abruptly, swaying slightly. I hear the whispers, too, about you and Owen, about those 2 nights. Caleb, please, don't. He pointed an unsteady finger at her. Don't lie to me. I see how you look when his name comes up. I see you watching for him out the window. You're imagining things. Am I? He moved toward her, and Eleanor forced herself not to retreat. Maybe I should ask my brother what really happened in that cabin. Man to man. Nothing happened, Eleanor said firmly. Your brother saved my life, nothing more. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. You're probably telling the truth. Owen's too noble to touch another man's woman, too broken to want her anyway. He grabbed the whiskey bottle and headed for the door. I'm going to town. Don't wait up. After he left, Eleanor sank into a chair, shaking. The accusation in Caleb's eyes had hit too close to the truth, not of what had happened, but of what she'd felt. Still felt, if she was honest with herself. The memory of those 2 days in the cabin had taken on the quality of a dream. Too perfect to be real, too real to forget. The next morning, Caleb was apologetic again, bringing her a length of blue calico from town as a peace offering. But the damage was done. She could feel him watching her, measuring her reactions, testing her responses. The easy affection of their first days was gone, replaced by suspicion and resentment. The situation reached a breaking point 2 weeks after the wedding. Caleb had been drinking since noon, brooding over some perceived slight from a neighbor. Eleanor tried to stay out of his way, but at dinner, he exploded. "You think you're too good for me," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "Coming here with your airs and graces, making me look like a fool. I've never—" "Shut up!" He stood so violently, his chair toppled backward. "I took you in when you had nothing. And this is how you repay me? Mooning over my brother like some lovesick girl? Caleb, you're drunk. Please." The slap came without warning, snapping her head to the side. Eleanor tasted blood where her teeth had cut her cheek. For a moment, they both froze, equally shocked by the violence. "Eleanor," Caleb began, reaching for her. She ran, out the door into the gathering darkness, coatless and hatless, fleeing into the night. Behind her, she heard Caleb calling, but she didn't stop. Her feet found the familiar path without conscious thought, up the ridge, through the stand of pines, toward the small cabin where she'd once felt safe. The storm struck when she was halfway there. Not the slow, steady snowfall of before, but a sudden, vicious blizzard that seemed to come from nowhere. Within minutes, she was lost, stumbling through white darkness, her thin dress offering no protection against the cutting wind. She fell, struggled up, fell again. The cold was seeping into her bones, making her thoughts sluggish. Some part of her recognized the danger. She'd seen what the Montana winter could do to those caught unprepared. But another part, the part that was so tired of fighting, whispered that it would be peaceful to simply lie down in the snow and rest. Then strong hands seized her shoulders, pulling her upright. "Eleanor, look at me!" "Owen," she tried to focus on his face, but the world was spinning. He cursed, scooped her up in his arms, and began carrying her through the storm. She pressed her face against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather. The warmth of the cabin was painful after the numbing cold. Owen set her in the chair by the stove, his movements quick and efficient. He wrapped her in blankets, stoked the fire until it roared, then knelt before her, chafing her hands between his. "What were you thinking?" His voice was rough with fear and anger. "You could have died out there," she tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard. He saw the mark on her face then, already purpling into a bruise, and went very still. "He hit you?" It wasn't a question. Eleanor turned her face away, ashamed. "It was my fault. I provoked him." "No." Owen's voice was deadly quiet. "It was not your fault." He rose, and she saw murder in his eyes. "I'll kill him." "No!" She caught his arm as he turned toward the door. "Please, Owen, don't. It will only make things worse." "Worse?" He stared at her in disbelief. "Eleanor, he struck you, my brother or not. He's my husband." The words tasted like ashes. "I made vows. For better or worse. This isn't what you vowed for." "Isn't it?" She laughed bitterly. A desperate woman marrying a stranger for security. We both knew what this was. Owen knelt before her again, his hands gentle as he examined her bruised face. "This isn't right. You don't deserve this. What I deserve and what I have are two different things." She caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. "Just as what I want and what I can have are two different things." Their eyes met, and the truth hung between them. Unspoken, but understood. Owen pulled away first, standing abruptly. "You can't go back tonight. The storm's too bad, and you need to warm up properly. People will talk more than they already do. Let them." He moved to prepare tea, his back to her. "Your safety matters more than gossip." They spent another night in the cabin, but it was different from before. The easy companionship was gone, replaced by an awareness that seemed to charge the very air between them. They spoke little, each lost in thoughts they dared not voice. When morning came, the storm had passed. Owen saddled his horse to take her back, but Eleanor stopped him. "I'll walk. It's not far, and I need time to think." He didn't argue, though she could see he wanted to. At the door, he caught her arm gently. "If he hurts you again." "He won't." She tried to sound confident. It was the whiskey. He's always sorry after. Owen's expression said what he thought of that excuse, but he released her. My door is always open. Eleanor, remember that. She walked back through the pristine snow, each step taking her further from where she wanted to be and closer to where duty demanded she go. When the main house came into view, she saw Caleb on the porch, pacing. He ran to meet her, his face haggard with worry and shame. Eleanor, thank God. I'm so sorry. So terribly sorry. I don't know what came over me. The drink, the jealousy. He fell to his knees in the snow before her. Please forgive me. I swear it will never happen again. Looking down at him, Eleanor felt nothing but exhaustion. Get up, Caleb. You'll catch your death. He scrambled to his feet, hovering anxiously as she walked past him into the house. Where were you? I was terrified you'd frozen in the storm. I found shelter, she said simply, removing her wet boots. Where? His voice sharpened despite his contrite posture. Eleanor, where did you spend the night? She met his gaze steadily. Does it matter? I'm here now. I'm your wife. Isn't that what you wanted? Something in her tone must have warned him not to push further. He nodded, subdued. I'll make this up to you. I promise. Things will be different. Eleanor nodded, not believing him but too tired to argue. She went about her morning tasks mechanically, aware of Caleb watching her, trying to gauge her mood. The bruise on her face darkened as the day wore on, a visible reminder of the line that had been crossed. But it was the invisible bruises that hurt more, the death of hope, the cage of circumstance closing around her. She'd fled one form of desperation only to find another, and somewhere beyond the ridge, in a small cabin she could no longer visit, lived the man who'd shown her what kindness looked like, what safety felt like, what love might have been, in another life, another world. The small cabin in the mountains had become their sanctuary, though neither would speak the word aloud. For 3 days, Eleanor had taken shelter there while the worst blizzard in memory raged across Montana territory. Owen had found her near death in the snow after another of Caleb's drunken rages, carried her to safety, and nursed her back to health with the same quiet competence he'd shown that first night. Now, as firelight danced across the rough wooden walls, they sat across from each other at the small table, the remnants of their evening meal between them. Outside, the wind had finally stilled, leaving an almost oppressive silence broken only by the crack of logs in the stove. The storm's past, Owen said unnecessarily. They both knew what that meant. Eleanor nodded, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee long gone cold. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow and green, but new ones hidden beneath her dress told the continuing story of her marriage. He'll be looking for me. Let him look. Owen's voice held an edge that had grown sharper over the past days. You're not well enough to travel yet. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She was well enough in body, had been since the second day. It was her spirit that kept her here, in this small space where she could pretend the outside world didn't exist. Tell me about the war, she said suddenly. You never speak of it, but I see it in your eyes sometimes, the weight of it. Owen was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, what do you want to know? Whatever you need to tell. He rose, moving to add wood to the fire, though it didn't need it. I killed my first man at Shiloh. Boy, really, couldn't have been more than 16. Confederate charge at dawn, and he came through the smoke like a ghost. I put my bayonet through his chest before I even had time to think. He paused, his back to her. He called for his mother as he died. They all did, at the end. Eleanor said nothing, sensing this was a dam breaking. Words too long contained finally finding release. After that, it got easier. Had to, or you'd go mad. You learn not to look at their faces, not to think of them as men with families, sweethearts, dreams of their own. They were just targets, obstacles between you and surviving another day. His voice was flat, emotionless. I got good at it, too good. They made me a sergeant, then a lieutenant, gave me medals for my efficiency at sending boys to their deaths." He turned back to her, and she saw the full weight of his guilt in his eyes. "I came home with those medals, and people called me a hero, but heroes don't wake up screaming, seeing the faces of everyone they killed. Heroes don't have to drink themselves to sleep just to escape the memories." "You did what you had to do," Eleanor said softly. "It was war." "Was it?" He laughed bitterly. "Sometimes I think we just told ourselves that to justify the slaughter. Boys killing boys over rich men's principles and politicians' pride." She rose and went to him, taking his scarred hands in hers. "You're not that man anymore, aren't I?" He looked down at their joined hands. "Sometimes I think the war killed the best parts of me, left only the damaged pieces behind. I don't believe that." She reached up to touch his face, feeling him tremble at the contact. "The man who saved me, who sheltered me, who shows such gentleness. That's who you really are. The war may have scarred you, but it didn't destroy you." "Eleanor," his voice was rough with emotion. "We can't." "I know." She didn't remove her hand. "But please, just for tonight, can we pretend the world beyond these walls doesn't exist? That we're just two people who found each other in a storm?" He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do." She stepped closer, feeling the heat of him through his shirt. "I'm asking for one night where I don't have to be afraid. One night where I can choose for myself. Is that so wrong? You're married to my brother. Your brother treats me like property he regrets purchasing." The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. "He bedded me on our wedding night like a duty to be endured, then went back to his whiskey and his cards. When he comes to me now, it's with rough hands and whiskey breath, taking what he considers his due." Owen's jaw tightened. "I should have killed him the first time he hurt you. And hang for it? Leave me a widow twice over." She shook her head. "That's not what I want from you." "Owen, what do you want?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Eleanor took a breath, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. "I want to know what it feels like to be touched with tenderness, to be held like I matter, to give myself freely instead of having it taken." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want to know what love feels like, even if it's only for one night." "Eleanor," she silenced him with a kiss, soft and desperate and full of longing. For a moment he stood frozen. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him with a sound that might have been surrender or salvation. They came together with the desperation of the condemned, knowing that dawn would bring reality crashing back, but unable to deny themselves this moment of grace. Owen's hands were gentle as he'd promised, reverent in their exploration. He touched her like she was something precious, something holy, so different from Caleb's careless possession that she wept from the sweetness of it. They loved with words and silence, with touch and breath, with all the tenderness two damaged souls could offer each other. In the darkness of the cabin, with only firelight to witness, they created their own small world where love was possible and choices mattered. Afterward, they lay entwined on the narrow bed, unwilling to lose even an inch of contact. Eleanor traced the scar on Owen's chest, the one she'd glimpsed that first day. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his heart. "Other wounds hurt more. Tell me we haven't damned ourselves," she whispered. "Tell me God understands desperation. If he doesn't, then he's no God worth worrying about." Owen pulled her closer. "I've done things in my life I'll answer for. This isn't one of them." They talked through the night, sharing stories of their lives before fate brought them together. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Missouri, her parents' small farm, the simple dreams she'd had before cholera took everything. Owen spoke of the ranch before the war, when their parents were alive and the future seemed bright with promise. "I was going to marry Rebecca Morrison," he confessed. "Build a house on the eastern pasture, raise horses. Caleb would have the cattle operation. I'd have the horses. We had it all planned out." What changed? Everything. He was quiet for a moment. I came back different, broken. Rebecca took one look at me and knew I wasn't the boy she'd promised to wait for. She was right to marry Tom Henderson. He could give her the life she deserved. And you decided you deserved nothing. I decided I'd taken enough from this world. Time to stop taking. Eleanor propped herself up on an elbow, looking down at him. What about giving? What about the gifts you have to offer? What gifts? His smile was sad. I'm a damaged soldier hiding in a cabin, too broken to live properly among people. You're the kindest man I've ever known, she said fiercely. The gentlest, the most honorable. You saved my life twice over, once from the storm, once from despair. Those aren't small gifts. Owen. He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. What happens tomorrow? I don't know. She lay back down, fitting herself against him. I know I should feel guilty. I know this is a sin by every measure society has, but all I feel is grateful. Is that terrible? If it is, we're terrible together. As dawn approached, they dressed in silence, each movement heavy with the weight of ending. Eleanor fixed her hair as best she could, trying to erase the evidence of the night from her appearance, if not her heart. I should go alone, she said at the door. It will be better if— No. Owen was already reaching for his coat. I won't have you walking back alone. Not again. They rode double on his horse, Eleanor sitting sideways in front of him, his arms around her as he held the reins. The journey was too short, each hoofbeat bringing them closer to separation. As they crested the ridge above the main house, Owen pulled up. I can't forget this, Eleanor said quietly. I won't forget this, nor will I. He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing her in one last time. Be careful, Eleanor, please. If he hurts you again, I know where to find shelter. She turned in his arms to look at him one last time. Thank you for everything. He helped her down, and she walked the remaining distance alone. At the door of the main house, she paused and looked back. Owen sat motionless on the ridge, a sentinel watching over her. She raised her hand, and he touched his hat brim before turning his horse toward his cabin. Inside, she found Caleb passed out at the kitchen table, empty bottles surrounding him. He didn't stir as she moved quietly through the house, didn't wake as she began preparing breakfast. When he finally roused, groaning and clutching his head, she was ready with coffee and calm demeanor. Where were you? He asked, though his voice lacked real concern. The Hendersons. The storm was too bad to travel. The lie came easily. Mrs. Henderson sent some preserves for you. He grunted, apparently satisfied. If he noticed the change in her, the strange peace that had settled over her despite everything, he didn't comment. Perhaps he was simply relieved not to face recriminations for whatever he'd done in her absence. Eleanor went about her duties mechanically, but inside, she carried a secret warmth. She had known love, real love, if only for a night. Whatever came next, no one could take that from her. 2 weeks later, she realized she was with child as she stood in the cold outhouse, trembling with the knowledge. She did the calculations desperately. It could be Caleb's. He'd come to her bed often enough in those early days. No one would question the timing. No one except her. And perhaps Owen, if he ever learned of it. She pressed a hand to her still flat stomach and made a choice. This child would be raised as a Whitlock, with all the security that name provided. The truth would remain locked in her heart, another secret to carry. But she would love this baby with all the fierce devotion she possessed, because regardless of whose seed had planted it, she knew exactly when this new life had been conceived. In that small cabin, in the midst of a storm, when two broken people had found wholeness in each other's arms. It was enough. It had to be. Eleanor stood in the parlor of the main house, her hands folded over the slight swell of her stomach, watching through the frost-covered window as riders approached. She recognized Owen's familiar form even at a distance. The way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders. He hadn't been to the main house since that night 2 months ago. Caleb, she called. Your brother's coming. Caleb emerged from his study, still in his cups despite the early hour. His drinking had worsened since she'd told him about the baby, oscillating between maudlin affection for his growing family and dark suspicions about the child's paternity. "What's he want?" Caleb muttered, squinting through the window. "Probably here to lecture me about something." Owen dismounted in the yard, and Eleanor's heart constricted at the sight of him. He looked thinner, worn, as if the separation had been eating at him the way it had at her. Their eyes met through the glass for just a moment before she forced herself to look away. "Eleanor." Caleb's voice was sharp. "Go to the kitchen. Men's business." She wanted to protest but knew better. As she turned to leave, Caleb caught her arm, his grip just shy of painful. "And don't go listening at doors. I'll know if you do." In the kitchen, Eleanor busied herself with baking, trying not to strain to hear the voices from the parlor. The brothers' conversation started low but soon escalated. She caught fragments, something about mortgage payments, about the ranch's finances, about responsibilities. Then Caleb's voice rose to a shout. "Don't you dare judge me! Sitting up there in your cabin like some holy hermit while I try to keep this place running." Owen's response was too quiet to hear, but it must have enraged Caleb further. There was the crash of breaking glass, then the front door slamming. Eleanor rushed to the window in time to see Owen mounting his horse. As he turned to leave, his eyes found hers again. The pain she saw there matched her own. Caleb stormed into the kitchen, reeking of whiskey and rage. "He thinks he's so much better than me," he snarled. "Coming here, telling me how to run my own ranch, how to treat my own wife. Owen said something about me?" The question was a mistake. Caleb's face darkened. "Oh, he's very concerned about you, very protective." He advanced on her, backing her against the counter. "Makes a man wonder what happened during those nights in that cabin." "You know what happened." "Nothing." "Do I?" His hand shot out, gripping her chin, forcing her to meet his bloodshot eyes. "Because my sainted brother seems awfully interested in another man's wife. And you've been different since then. Distant, cold. I'm carrying your child," Eleanor said steadily. "That should tell you everything you need to know." For a moment, something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Doubt, fear, perhaps even love. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar sneer. Maybe you're carrying a bastard and hoping I'm too drunk to do the math." He released her roughly and stumbled back to his study, leaving Eleanor shaking with anger and fear. She pressed her hands to her stomach protectively. Whatever Caleb suspected, he couldn't prove anything. The timing was close enough. The child would be safe. But as her pregnancy progressed, Caleb's behavior became increasingly erratic. Some days he was the charming man who'd written those letters, bringing her small gifts, talking excitedly about names for the baby. Other days, he was a stranger filled with suspicion and rage. The breaking point came on a cold February morning. Eleanor was heavy with child, moving slowly as she prepared breakfast. Caleb had been out all night, and when he finally stumbled in, she could smell perfume on his clothes, the cloying scent of the saloon women from town. "You're late," she said quietly, not looking at him. "And you're fat," he shot back, "like a sow ready for market." Eleanor's hand stilled on the breadboard. "Is that how you see me? The mother of your child?" "My child?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "We'll see about that when it's born. If it comes out with Owen's dark hair and those hollow eyes of his. Stop it. Or what?" He grabbed her arm, spinning her to face him. "You'll run to him again? Spread your legs for my brother like the whore you are?" The slap came without thought, Eleanor's hand connecting with his cheek with all the force of months of suppressed anger. They stood frozen, both shocked by her action. Then Caleb smiled, a cold, cruel expression. "There she is, the real Eleanor. Not the meek little wife, but the woman who spent 2 nights alone with my brother." He raised his own hand, and Eleanor braced for the blow, but it never came. Instead, Caleb laughed again and stumbled toward the stairs. "I'm going to town," he announced, "to file some papers, legal papers, about the child's parentage. Want to make sure everything's official." Fear clenched Eleanor's stomach. She didn't know what papers he meant, but his tone suggested nothing good. As soon as he left, she threw on her heaviest shawl and made her way laboriously through the snow toward Owen's cabin. She was halfway there when the pain struck, sharp and sudden, doubling her over. Too soon, she thought desperately. The baby wasn't due for another month, but her body had its own timeline, and as another contraction gripped her, she knew she was in trouble. "Owen!" she called out, but the wind seized her voice. She struggled forward, each step agony, until she saw the smoke from his chimney. "Owen!" This time he heard. The cabin door flew open, and he was running toward her, coatless, in the snow. He reached her just as her knees buckled. "The baby!" she gasped. "It's coming." Owen didn't waste time on questions. He scooped her up despite her protests about his back and carried her into the cabin. The familiar warmth and scent of the place made her sob with relief and grief combined. "I need to get the doctor," Owen said, settling her on the bed. "No time." Another contraction seized her. "Please, don't leave me." What followed were the longest hours of Eleanor's life. Owen, who had delivered countless calves and foals, found himself terrified by the human birth unfolding before him. But his hands were steady as he helped her, his voice calm as he talked her through the pain. "Tell me about Missouri," he said during a brief respite. "Tell me about your mother's garden." So she did, gasping out memories between contractions, the smell of tomatoes in summer, the way the corn grew tall enough to hide in, her mother's pride in her roses. Owen kept her talking, kept her focused on anything but the fear that something was wrong. When the baby finally came, it was with a rush of blood that made Owen's face go white. But then there was a cry, thin but strong, and he was placing a tiny, perfect form on Eleanor's chest. "A girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have a daughter." Eleanor looked down at the baby through tears. Dark hair, like Owen's, but the shape of the face, the set of the chin, that was pure Whitlock. No one looking at her could say definitively which brother had fathered her. "She's beautiful," Owen whispered, and Eleanor heard everything he couldn't say in those 2 words. "Help me name her," Eleanor said impulsively. She should have a name from someone who helped bring her into the world. Owen was quiet for a long moment. "My mother's name was Grace." "Grace," Eleanor touched the baby's tiny fist. "Grace Whitlock. It's perfect." They existed in a bubble of peace for perhaps an hour. Eleanor dozed while Owen kept watch over mother and child. Then the door burst open, and Caleb stumbled in, wild-eyed and stinking of whiskey. "I knew it," he slurred, taking in the scene. "Knew I'd find you here, my wife, my brother. How cozy." "Caleb," Owen said carefully. "Eleanor went into labor. I had to help." "Shut up!" Caleb's hand went to the gun at his hip. "Just shut up, both of you. I know what this is, what it's been all along." "Put the gun away," Owen said, moving to shield Eleanor and the baby. "You're drunk. You don't know what you're doing." "Don't I?" Caleb drew the weapon, waving it wildly. "My perfect brother, the war hero. Had to have everything, didn't you? Even my wife." "Caleb, please." Eleanor struggled to sit up. "The baby, the baby." Caleb laughed hysterically. "Yes, let's see this baby. Let's see which brother it favors." He took a stumbling step forward, and Owen moved to intercept him. The brothers grappled, the gun between them. Eleanor screamed as they crashed into the table, sending the lamp flying. Then the gun went off, the sound enormous in the small space. For a moment, everything stopped. Then Caleb stepped back, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something like surprise. "Owen," he said, his voice suddenly young and confused. I don't feel right." He collapsed, and Owen caught him, lowering him gently to the floor. Eleanor watched in horror as Owen pressed his hands to the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Get help," Owen said tersely. "Ride to town. Get the doctor. I can't leave. Go!" The command in his voice brooked no argument. Take my horse. Wrap the baby well. Go now!" Eleanor moved on instinct, swaddling Grace tightly, pulling on her shawl with shaking hands. At the door, she looked back to see Owen cradling his brother, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. Caleb's eyes were already glazing, but his hand clutched Owen's shirt. The ride to town was a nightmare blur. Eleanor held Grace against her chest, urging Owen's horse through the snow while her body screamed in protest. By the time she reached the doctor's house, she was sobbing with pain and fear. "There's been an accident," she gasped as Dr. Morrison opened the door. "At Owen's cabin. Caleb's been shot. Please!" The doctor was already reaching for his bag. "Stay here," he ordered. "You're in no condition. I'm going back." "Mrs. Whitlock, I'm going back." They made the return journey with agonizing slowness, the doctor's buggy struggling through the drifts. Eleanor held Grace, who had begun to cry, a thin wail that seemed to echo her own anguish. When they reached the cabin, they found Owen still on the floor, still holding his brother, but Caleb was gone, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Owen looked up as they entered, and Eleanor saw he was crying. "I tried," he said brokenly. "I tried to save him. He was my brother, and I tried." "Doctor." Morrison knelt to examine the body, then stood slowly. "Nothing you could have done, son. Bullet hit the artery. He'd have bled out in minutes." "It was an accident," Eleanor said quickly. They were struggling. "The gun went off?" "It was an accident." The doctor looked between them, taking in the newborn baby, the blood on the floor, the grief on their faces. "I'll need to notify the sheriff. There'll be questions." "I know." Owen hadn't moved, still cradling Caleb's body. Tell them it was my fault. I tried to take the gun away. I should have been more careful. Owen, no!" "Tell them that." His voice was flat. "Dead." "It's the truth. Near enough." The doctor left to fetch the sheriff and the undertaker. Eleanor sank into a chair, Grace fussing at her breast. The cabin that had been their sanctuary was now a place of death, the blood on the floor a testament to how thoroughly their lives had been shattered. "He was going to hurt you," Owen said finally. "Both of you. I couldn't let that happen. This isn't your fault, isn't it?" He finally looked at her, and she saw the full weight of his guilt. If we hadn't. "Don't!" Eleanor's voice was fierce despite her exhaustion. "Don't you dare take this on yourself. Caleb made his choices. The drinking, the violence, coming here with a gun, those were his choices. He was my brother, my responsibility. He was a grown man who couldn't accept responsibility for his own life." She shifted Grace to her other arm, wincing at the movement. "You saved us, Owen. Whatever else happened, you saved us." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, throwing harsh light on the tragedy before them. Soon the sheriff would come with his questions. The town would gossip. There would be a funeral, an investigation, judgments passed by people who hadn't lived their truth. But for now, there was just the three of them, Owen, Eleanor, and tiny Grace, whose birth and Caleb's death would forever be entwined. A ending and a beginning, wrapped in blood and snow and the weight of choices that could never be undone. The jail cell was cold and damp, with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. Owen sat on the narrow bunk, his head in his hands, listening to the sounds of the town beyond the barred window. 3 days had passed since Caleb's death. 3 days of questions and accusations and the weight of a community's judgment. Sheriff Watson had been thorough but not unkind. The physical evidence supported Owen's account, the angle of the wound, the powder burns, all consistent with a struggle over the weapon. But the circumstances, Eleanor giving birth in Owen's cabin, Caleb arriving drunk and armed, the history of tension between the brothers. It painted a picture that fed the town's hunger for scandal. The door to the cells opened, and Owen looked up to see Eleanor standing there, Grace bundled in her arms. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she moved carefully, still recovering from the birth, but her chin was high, her gaze steady. "The sheriff said I could have a few minutes," she said quietly. Owen stood, gripping the bars. You shouldn't be up. You should be resting. How can I rest with you in here? She came closer, close enough that he could see Grace's tiny face peeking from the blankets. Owen, I've been thinking about what needs to be done. Eleanor, listen to me. Her voice was urgent. I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it, about Caleb's drinking, the violence, everything. They need to understand why you had to protect us. No. Owen's voice was firm. Caleb's dead. Let him rest with whatever dignity he has left. Dignity? Eleanor's eyes flashed. What dignity is there in letting you hang for protecting your brother's wife and child? They won't hang me. Manslaughter at worst. A few years in prison? A few years. Eleanor's voice broke. Owen, please, let me help you. He reached through the bars to touch her face gently. You have Grace to think about now. She needs a mother with a reputation intact, not one who's at the center of a scandal. If you testify about Caleb's behavior, if the truth about us comes out, what kind of life will she have? Eleanor leaned into his touch, tears flowing freely. What kind of life will she have knowing the man who saved her mother's life is in prison because of it? A respectable one. That's all that matters. The sheriff appeared in the doorway. Time's up, Mrs. Whitlock. Eleanor pressed closer to the bars, her free hand clutching Owen's. This isn't over, she whispered fiercely. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for us. After she left, Owen returned to the bunk, his mind churning. He'd made peace with the possibility of prison. Saw it perhaps as a fitting penance for surviving the war when so many hadn't, for loving his brother's wife, for failing to save Caleb from himself. But the image of Eleanor's face, desperate and determined, haunted him. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Judge Samuel Curtis, the circuit judge who would preside over the trial, entered the cell area accompanied by Sheriff Watson. Curtis was an older man, weathered by years of frontier justice, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through pretense. Mr. Whitlock, the judge said, settling himself on a stool the sheriff provided. I've been reviewing your case. Interesting circumstances. Owen said nothing, waiting. Your brother was well known in town. His drinking, his gambling, his temper. The judge's eyes were knowing. Several people have mentioned seeing Mrs. Whitlock with bruises she tried to hide. Still, Owen remained silent. Then there's your service record. Curtis continued. Decorated soldier by all accounts. Man of good character before and after the war. No history of violence except in service to your country. Is there a point to this, Your Honor? The point, Mr. Whitlock, is that I've seen enough frontier justice to know when a man's protecting someone. The question is whether you're protecting your dead brother's reputation or someone else entirely. A commotion outside interrupted whatever response Owen might have made. Voices raised in argument. Then Eleanor burst in, Sheriff Watson trying unsuccessfully to stop her. Your Honor, she said breathlessly, I need to speak with you. It's about the case. Mrs. Whitlock, this is highly irregular. Please. She clutched Grace tighter. I have information relevant to my husband's death. Information that changes everything. Judge Curtis studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Sheriff, give us the room. Watson left reluctantly. Eleanor took a deep breath, then began to speak. She told it all, the violence, the drinking, the night Caleb had struck her and she'd fled into the storm. She spoke of Owen's kindness, his protection, the sanctuary his cabin had provided. Her voice remained steady until she reached the night Grace was conceived, then faltered. Your Honor, she said quietly, I won't stand before God and man and lie about what happened. Owen Whitlock saved my life more than once. My daughter was born in his cabin because I went to him when the pain started, knowing I'd be safe there. My husband came with a gun, drunk and violent, making threats. The gun went off during the struggle. That's the truth of it. And the nature of your relationship with your brother-in-law, the judge asked carefully. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I love him. I've loved him since those first days in the storm. But Owen is too honorable to act on those feelings while I was married to his brother. Nothing improper happened between us until... She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. I see. Judge Curtis was quiet for a moment. And the child's parentage? Is Whitlock, Eleanor said firmly. That's all anyone needs to know. Owen had risen from the bunk, gripping the bars. Eleanor, stop, please. No. She turned to him, eyes blazing. I won't let you martyr yourself for propriety's sake. Not when Grace needs you. Not when I need you. Judge Curtis stood slowly. Mrs. Whitlock, I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to speak such truths. Sheriff Watson, the sheriff reappeared. Your Honor, I'll be convening court this afternoon. Have the prosecutor ready? He looked between Eleanor and Owen. This case isn't as clear-cut as it seemed. There are mitigating circumstances to consider. The courtroom was packed that afternoon, the whole town eager for spectacle. Eleanor sat in the front row, Grace sleeping in her arms, trying not to hear the whispers around her. Owen was brought in shackled, which made her heart clench. But his eyes found hers immediately, offering silent strength. Judge Curtis called the court to order. What followed was unlike any trial the town had seen. The judge himself questioned witnesses, drawing out testimonies about Caleb's drinking, his gambling debts, his increasingly erratic behavior. Mrs. Morrison, despite her love of gossip, admitted she'd seen Eleanor with bruises. Tom Henderson confirmed Caleb had been drunk and talking wildly about his wife and brother the night he died. When Eleanor was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She repeated what she'd told the judge, her voice clear despite the tears that threatened. When the prosecutor tried to push about her relationship with Owen, Judge Curtis cut him off. The woman has been honest about her feelings, the judge said sharply. What matters is what happened the night Caleb Whitlock died, not what might have been in anyone's heart. Owen testified last, his account matching Eleanor's in every detail. He took responsibility for not being more careful in the struggle, for not finding another way to protect Eleanor and Grace. But he would not, despite the prosecutor's pushing, express regret for protecting them. My brother was not himself, Owen said quietly. The drink had taken him to a dark place, but he was still my brother, and I grieve for him. I only wish I could have saved him from himself before it came to this. Judge Curtis retired to consider his verdict. The wait felt eternal, the courtroom buzzing with speculation. Eleanor held Grace tighter, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. When the judge returned, his face was grave. This court finds Owen Whitlock guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Caleb Whitlock. Eleanor's heart sank, but the judge wasn't finished. However, given the circumstances, Mr. Whitlock's clear intent to protect Mrs. Whitlock and her newborn child from imminent harm, his exemplary service record, and the accidental nature of the shooting, this court sentences him to time served plus 1 year of probation, to be served on the Whitlock Ranch under the supervision of Sheriff Watson. The courtroom erupted. Some protested the leniency, others nodded approval. Eleanor sagged with relief, tears flowing freely. Owen's eyes closed briefly, and she saw his lips move in what might have been a prayer. As the crowd dispersed, Judge Curtis approached Eleanor. Ma'am, you showed real courage today. Not many would have risked so much for the truth. It wasn't courage, Your Honor, Eleanor said softly. It was necessity. I couldn't let an innocent man suffer for protecting us. Innocent might be stretching it, the judge said with a slight smile. But justified. Yes, I believe so. Take care of each other. And that baby. She's lucky to have people who love her so fiercely. Outside the courthouse, Owen stood blinking in the afternoon sun, still seeming stunned by his freedom. Eleanor approached slowly, suddenly uncertain. So much had been said in court, truths laid bare for all to see. Where did they go from here? Eleanor, Owen began, but she stopped him. Take us home, she said simply. Please, just take us home." The ride back to the ranch was silent except for Grace's occasional coos. The main house loomed before them, full of memories both bitter and sweet. But as Owen helped Eleanor down from the wagon, she shook her head. "Not there," she said. "The cabin. That's home now." Owen searched her face. "Are you sure? People will talk more than they already are." "Let them." Eleanor shifted Grace in her arms. "I'm tired of living for what people think. Tired of pretending. Caleb is gone, and I grieve for what he might have been. But you and I and Grace, we're what's left. We're family now. However unconventional." They made their way to the cabin as snow began to fall again. Gentle this time, like a benediction. Inside, Owen built up the fire while Eleanor settled Grace in the drawer they'd fashioned into a makeshift cradle. The space that had seen so much shelter, love, birth, and death seemed to welcome them back. "I need to ask," Owen said quietly, watching Grace sleep. "Is she—" "I don't know," Eleanor answered honestly. "And it doesn't matter. She's a Whitlock. She's ours. That's all that matters now." Owen pulled her into his arms then, holding her as she finally allowed herself to truly grieve for Caleb, for what might have been, for the innocence they'd all lost. When the tears finally stopped, they stood together in the firelight, foreheads touching. "What now?" Owen whispered. "Now we live," Eleanor said simply. "We raise Grace, we work the ranch, we face whatever comes together. Is that enough?" "It's everything," Owen replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of sorrow and hope in equal measure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that led to and from the cabin, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside, a new family forged from loss and love began the slow work of healing, of building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing in Montana territory ever was. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. 5 years had passed since that terrible winter, and the Montana territory had seen many changes. The railroad had pushed further west, bringing new settlers and new challenges. But in the small cabin expanded now with 2 additional rooms, some things remained constant: the love between Owen and Eleanor, and their devotion to Grace, who at 5 years old was a whirlwind of energy with her mother's strong will and what might have been her father's dark eyes. They had married quietly the summer after Caleb's death, a simple ceremony with only Sheriff Watson and his wife as witnesses. The town's gossip had eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals, though some still whispered when the family came to town for supplies. On this particular autumn morning, Eleanor stood at the window watching Owen teach Grace to ride. The little girl sat atop a gentle mare, her face bright with concentration as Owen walked beside her, his hand steady on the bridle. "Keep your back straight, little one." Owen's voice carried on the crisp air. "That's it. You're a natural, just like you're—" He paused, as he always did, then finished. "Just like a true Whitlock." Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on her belly where new life grew. This child would be Owen's without question, conceived in love and wanted with a fierce joy that still sometimes took her breath away. She hadn't told him yet, waiting for the right moment. A dust cloud on the horizon drew her attention. Riders approaching, moving fast. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to the rifle by the door, old habits from the early days when not all visitors were welcome. But as the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead figure and her tension eased. It was Marcus Hayes, a young homesteader who'd settled nearby 2 years ago with his pregnant wife. Owen had helped them through their first winter, sharing knowledge and supplies, and a friendship had grown. "Owen," Marcus called out, his voice urgent. "We need help. It's Sarah. The baby's coming early, and something's wrong." Owen lifted Grace down from the horse, his movements swift but calm. "How early?" 6 weeks, maybe more. She's in pain, bad pain. Doc Morrison is drunk again, and the midwife is 20 miles away at the Johnson spread." Eleanor was already gathering supplies: clean cloths, her sewing kit, the herbs she'd learned to use. "I'll come," she said. "Grace, you'll stay with Mrs. Henderson in town." "I want to help," Grace protested, her small face set in stubborn lines. Owen knelt before her. "You can help by being good for Mrs. Henderson. Can you do that for me?" Grace nodded solemnly, and within minutes they were mounted and riding hard toward the Hayes homestead. Eleanor rode astride now. Propriety be damned. Her medical supplies in saddlebags. They found Sarah Hayes in agony, her husband pacing helplessly outside the small soddy. Eleanor took charge immediately, drawing on memories of her own difficult labor and what she'd learned since from the few medical books Owen had obtained for her. "The baby's turned wrong," she said after examining Sarah. "We need to turn it, or neither of them will survive." What followed were hours of struggle, Eleanor working with steady hands despite the young woman's screams. Owen assisting with a competence born of years tending injured soldiers. Marcus waited outside, praying audibly to any god who might listen. As the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, a baby's cry finally pierced the air. Eleanor placed the tiny but perfect boy in his mother's arms, both of them crying with relief and joy. "You saved them," Marcus said later, pumping Owen's hand with tears streaming down his face. "Both of them. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Owen said quietly. "That's what neighbors do." As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Grace sleeping in Owen's arms, Eleanor finally spoke. "I'm pregnant." Owen's horse actually stopped moving. So sudden was his stillness. "What? You heard me?" She couldn't help but smile at his stunned expression. Come spring, Grace will have a brother or sister. The joy that transformed Owen's face was worth the wait. He reached across the space between their horses to grasp her hand. "Are you certain?" "Very certain." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Owen spoke again. "What we did today, helping Sarah. I've been thinking, the territory needs more healers, real medical knowledge, not just folk wisdom and prayer." "What are you suggesting?" "There's a program in Denver. They're training women as midwives and nurses. Proper training, with certificates and everything. It's a 6-month course." Eleanor's heart raced at the possibility. But the ranch, and Grace, and the new baby. "We'd manage. Marcus owes us a debt. He'd help with the ranch work. Mrs. Henderson would love to have Grace for extended visits. And you'd be back before the baby comes. You've thought about this before. I've seen you. Eleanor, the way you took charge today. The way you've helped other families when illness strikes. You have a gift. It seems wrong not to develop it." That night, as Grace slept in her little room and they lay entwined in their bed, they talked through the possibilities. It would mean sacrifice, difficulty, time apart. But it would also mean Eleanor could offer real help to the scattered families of the territory. Could save lives like she'd saved Sarah and her baby. "I want to do it," Eleanor said finally. "But not until after this baby is born and weaned. Then, yes, I want to learn." Owen pulled her closer. "I'm proud of you, proud of who you've become. We've both become different people than we were." Eleanor said softly, "Sometimes I think about those two broken souls who found each other in a storm, and I can barely recognize them." "I can," Owen said. "They're still there, just healed over, like scar tissue that's stronger than the original skin." A cry from Grace's room interrupted them. Eleanor started to rise, but Owen stopped her. "I'll go." She listened as he soothed their daughter back to sleep, his voice low and patient. When he returned, Eleanor was sitting up, looking thoughtful. "I want to tell her," she said, "when she's older, about Caleb, about everything. She deserves the truth." Owen was quiet for a moment. "She might hate us for it. She might, or she might understand that love isn't always simple, that good people sometimes make complicated choices." Eleanor took his hand. "I won't have her finding out from others, from whispers and rumors. When she's ready, we'll tell her everything. Together. Everything together. Always." As the seasons turned, Their family grew and prospered. The new baby, a boy they named James after Eleanor's first husband, was born healthy and strong. Eleanor pursued her medical training, returning with knowledge that made her invaluable to the growing community. Owen expanded the ranch, taking on partners from among the newer settlers, creating something larger than just a family legacy. Grace grew tall and strong, with a quick mind and a healer's touch like her mother. She learned to ride and shoot from Owen, to heal and nurture from Eleanor. If she noticed that her Papa Owen sometimes looked at her with a wistfulness that suggested unspoken truths, she didn't question it. Not yet. One winter evening, much like that fateful night years ago, a blizzard trapped the family in the cabin. But now it was filled with warmth and laughter. James played with wooden soldiers by the fire while Grace read aloud from one of her school books. Eleanor worked on her medical notes while Owen mended harness leather. "Tell us a story, Papa," Grace demanded, setting aside her book. About the old days. Owen and Eleanor exchanged glances. They'd told her stories before, about the war, about building the ranch, about the early settlers, but never the whole story. Never their story. "What kind of story?" Owen asked carefully. "A love story," Grace said with the casual cruelty of childhood. "About how you and Mama met." Eleanor set down her notes. "It was a night like this," she began. "I knocked on a stranger's door in a terrible storm, half frozen and afraid, and Papa opened the door. He did, and he saved my life." Eleanor smiled at Owen. "In more ways than one." They told her a version of the truth about the storm, about kindness offered to a stranger, about love growing slowly from friendship and respect. The harder truths would come later, when Grace was old enough to understand the complexities of the adult heart. "That's beautiful," Grace sighed with satisfaction. "Like a fairy tale." "Not quite," Owen said quietly. "Fairy tales are simple. Real life is messier. But sometimes that makes the happiness at the end even more precious." Later, after the children were asleep, Eleanor and Owen stood at the window watching the snow fall. It had been nearly 6 years since that first storm brought them together. 6 years of joy and sorrow, of building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "The choices we made?" Owen turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I regret Caleb's death. I'll always carry that. But you, Grace, James, this life we've built, never, not for a single moment. Even though it started with a lie, me coming here to marry another man?" "It started with truth," Owen corrected. "Two broken people recognizing something in each other. Everything else. That was just the path we had to walk to get here." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting love and permanence and the peace of a storm finally passed. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside their home, built on love, sacrifice, and the courage to choose happiness despite the cost, all was warm and well. In the morning, the sun would return, revealing a world made new by snow. The challenges would continue: sick neighbors to tend, children to raise, a ranch to run, a community to serve. But they would face it all together, this unlikely family forged in winter's crucible, stronger for their trials and deeper in their love. And in the annals of Montana territory, though their story might be whispered about and debated, it would ultimately be remembered as what it truly was: a love story. Complicated, painful at times, born from tragedy but resulting in joy. A testament to the truth that sometimes the wrong beginning can lead to exactly the right ending. And that love, real love, can bloom even in the harshest winter, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The lamp burned low as Owen banked the fire for the night. Eleanor checked on the children one last time. Then they retired to their bed, two souls no longer broken but whole, healed by each other's love and the family they'd built from the ashes of the past. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, a new beginning, as fresh and full of promise as that first storm that brought them together all those years ago. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the untamed Montana Territory. I hope Eleanor and Owen's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine in the telling. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Leave a comment below and let me know. I love hearing from folks all around the world who gather around our virtual campfire. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, loss, and redemption in the American frontier. And share your thoughts about Eleanor and Owen's journey. Until next time, partners, keep your fires burning bright and your hearts open to love's possibilities.